And actually, these are some things that possibly Michael might even have some better insight on. But regarding safety, here's just a few things that we're going to be talking about. Disasters, medical, and threat. What happens when a disaster hits your church, or a medical thing hits your church, or you have a threat? First, I really suggest every church make this your next board meeting if you don't already do it. Appoint somebody who will be in charge in case of an emergency. Ask a couple people, but have somebody in your church that becomes kind of a master of all things messy, somebody who can take charge. Don't let it be the pastor, although the pastor can be aware of these things as well. And if you don't have somebody in your church that knows what they're doing, there's tons of community resources for training in the event of a disaster. Major disasters that could hit a church include fire, flood, wind, and earthquakes. All of those hit California recently. So just as a rule of thumb, for all the disasters that could happen, the most important thing is to have a plan. Every board should develop a disaster plan. And that one person that I said to appoint should know it like the back of their hand. And I would suggest at least once a year, this is a matter of your annual Board of Administration meeting, make it a point to go over the plan. And the plan should include a few key things. When a disaster happens, how do you warn people and who do you need to communicate with? Definitely needs to include a list of all of your emergency service providers, and everybody should memorize the simple number 911. But beyond that, if you have children involved, you should have a list, a calling list in your church that whoever's in charge of a disaster has access to. You'll need to call parents if their kids are stranded in the middle of a flood, for example. Have an evacuation plan. How is it that you're going to exit the church or the house where you're meeting at, and where is it you can find shelter in the event of that kind of storm? Know this. And the most important thing for the pastor, for the leaders of the church, and for whoever is in charge of your disaster planning is to always be calm and directive. During a disaster is not the time to ask people how they feel. During a disaster is the time to tell people what they need to do and to do it calmly and clearly. Okay, everybody, we all need to get up right now and exit the church. The exit for our church is through the center aisle and the side aisles. You will find 3 doors. Take the one that's closest to your aisle and leave. We're all going to meet at the far end of the parking lot next to the basketball court. Got it? On the count of 3, let's all stand up. 1, 2, 3. Now let's go. Walk, don't run. You don't shout it. You don't make a joke about it. Be calm and directive with whatever needs to happen. Okay, so what happens if a fire happens? Here's 3 little principles that are useful to be aware of. Again, this is not everything, but I just want you to be aware of a few things. First, if you see a fire in the church and people are in the church, the most important thing to do is start evacuating people. Again, you already have your evacuation plan. At least one person is aware of where to go, and you can provide clear and calm direction. Everybody do this. But at the same time, whoever is in charge of that can either him or herself or designate somebody immediately, call 911. That should happen at the same time. If there's a chance to extinguish a fire and you have the equipment to do it, and every church of size has a sprinkler system, it's required. Many churches don't, depending on their size and the number of people, but every church should also have fire extinguishers. So it is possible to put something out before it becomes big, and do try if it's safe to do that. But evacuate people away from danger. The first priority is to save lives. If a flood happens, what do you do? Our area has experienced a lot of floods recently, and a lot of property has been destroyed as a result. Same thing with fire last year. Again, somebody needs to be prepared. Do evacuate. You do not want to be in the building in the event of a flood. A fire often happens without any warning at all. In fact, I've never known of a warning for a fire unless it's a big one coming your way from a giant forest. Again, not too uncommon in our area. But floods are often something you can prepare for. Very often you'll know if there's going to be a major storm, and there will be warnings about flooding in your community. So if that's the case, first, take a page out of the book that we just heard earlier. Michael is actually canceling church for people because he wants them to be safe when things are icy and slick. If there's a flood and it's going to hit your church, tell people don't go to church that day. Better that they don't go to church than that they get trapped, injured, and die. However, you have a chance to prepare as well. Seal the building. Sandbags are freely available in most communities. It takes effort to put them out, but it will save your property. Regarding wind, which also happens more in the Midwest than in California, but in my own community, in Sonora, we had our town of Twain Harte crushed by a microburst that caused about $1.5 million worth of damage and destroyed some homes. Wind happens everywhere. When that happens, you should, in a windstorm, find shelter and find it in places that are safe, like in the frames of doorways, someplace that has real heft to it, under a desk, for example. Or if you have a basement that you can get into during a windstorm, that's the best place to go. We also, however, have a lot of earthquakes in California. Very similar, find places that are firm, frames, furnishings that are solid, under desks, under anything big, beds, whatever you can get under, that's great. But don't go low in the event of an earthquake. You don't want to be trapped in a basement when the building collapses. So if you can evacuate, that's fine, but make sure it's to a safe place. Safe evacuation is almost always 150 feet away from the place that is targeted and possibly under threat. Be aware that there are almost always emergency broadcasts to warn you, but also you need to give an emergency broadcast to people that are affected in your church when it comes to storms. What happens in the event of a medical disaster? That is, somebody in your church has a heart attack. Lord, this just happened at the one of our churches in Oroville last month. A wonderful member of the church actually had a coronary incident in the middle of church and collapsed. What do you do? Well, every church should have first aid, at least one first aid kit, and first aid kits available pretty much regularly everywhere, not able for kids to get into. But, you know, somebody cuts their leg, it's easy enough, clean it, put on a Band-Aid, whatever, all good. Not the same as cardiac care. An ambulatory electronic defibrillator is a device that many buildings, many churches can have, and there's actual training in the use of that and CPR near almost every church with your local hospital. American Red Cross will often have areas that will provide training. Have somebody in church that's trained. Many of you have nurses, but these things do happen. The larger your church is, the more likely that it will happen in your church. Have somebody that can respond to it if possible. If not, that's what 911 is for. And even if somebody can respond to it, still call 911. Get an ambulance to assist when there's a true medical emergency. Have that person who's able to direct contacts. Remember, we talked about somebody who's going to direct all of this. Call the people that are directly concerned with whoever was injured and make that contact, particularly if it's a minor that was injured. Their parents didn't know right away. One thing I'll say about crowd management, the last thing that anybody who has been injured needs is to have a bunch of people crowding around them, gawking, even if they're really concerned. So one of the first things you should do after somebody's applying aid, engaging CPR or defibrillating, after you've called 911, is very calmly, very clearly make some directions about giving space. Okay, everybody, we just saw that Jane went down on the second pew. We're going to stop and pray for her in a minute. First, what we need is for everybody to move away from that side of the church and onto this side. And we're going to pray while she is receiving her care. Let's do that. You give clear direction to move away. If it's at all possible, if somebody is injured and they can be moved, move them to a quiet and secure place. And then you can continue to administer care to them. But the most important thing is to administer care and provide space. If, by the way, and this happens, your heart goes out to the person that was injured, do not accept liability or offer to pay for their care. That would be a good-hearted mistake. Do provide care, but also contact your insurance agent right away, because this is one area where churches will often find even the best-hearted of people engaging in litigation against your church, and you don't want that. So don't accept liability. Whatever you do, don't offer to pay for services until you've contacted your insurance company, can work through the appropriate next steps. Well, what happens in terms of a threat? It's very unlikely that any of these disasters will ever happen to your church, but they might. One of the least likely things that would happen is that you might experience violence in your church, but it can happen. In fact, we've seen, I believe, 18 church-related shootings in the last 10 years in the United States. That's a lot. So I see a thumb up. Oh, more than that, more than 18. 18 that I saw on the FBI website that I read. So that doesn't mean I was talking about mass shootings. Anyways, regardless, it is a threat. Now, 18 is a very small percentage in terms of numbers of churches. It's more likely you'll be bitten by a shark than you will have somebody engage your church in this way, but it really can happen. So what do you do? There are a couple of threats that can happen: bomb, shooter, and some. I just want to talk about making your church safe in terms of children and sexual abuse. So normally bomb threats don't happen with churches, but they can, they have. When they do, they're almost always called in. Somebody takes the call, and it's almost always somebody who has the church phone number, which means either the pastor or the church secretary. So we have a checklist regarding how it is that you should handle a bomb threat call. And I would encourage you, pastor, and your secretary to have this. There are some simple things that should happen. You should take some notes and observe what you heard, how you heard it. And there are some questions that you can ask to perhaps discern who did this, why they're doing it, and what the legitimacy of the threat is. So you can assess all of that. Take notes. Definitely, as soon as you're off that call 911. There was a significant threat to your church. You can't handle that. The police, SWAT, and other teams can, and they should. So call 911. This is also a time when, if you deem it as a credible threat, if it's a group of giggling teenagers, you might not deem that as a credible threat. But if you deem it as a credible threat, you should evacuate everybody in the building immediately, even as you call 911. Make it a non-specific evacuation. Don't tell people, hey, there's a bomb in the building. Just say, we have an emergency and we need everybody to evacuate. Let's follow our plan. Well, what happens if a shooter or somebody that is violent comes into your church? This is clearly something that very few people ever hope to encounter, and when it happens, it's terrifying. So keep in mind a couple of things. By and large, you never want to confront somebody with a gun or who is violent. By and large, the best defense is always escape. So evacuate as safely as you can. Tell people, if it's at all possible, to evacuate where and how. Again, you don't necessarily have to say why. That could cause panic if you can evacuate people safely. Barricade if you cannot, or evacuate to a place where you can barricade. Make sure that there's a room that you can in some way put items to, put anything that would prevent somebody who's an active shooter from following you. Any obstacle you can put in the path is a good thing to do. Avoid, as I said, if at all possible, but what many people have learned, sadly, in the past several years is sometimes resistance is important. And if you can't get everybody out, and the only way to deal with this is to resist, particularly if you're trained in this, then please do. but avoid, again, if possible, and if you don't have training. We do not suggest that people should bring weapons to church to protect against this. One, the odds are extremely rare. Two, Jesus would tend to say, turn the other cheek, and we don't want to promote violence. The Bible also says, you are as guilty of the slaughter of one that you see being carried off to slaughter if you don't do something as you are of those that are carrying them off to slaughter. That's a paraphrase, but that speaks to our hearts as well. So just be engaged in understanding that protecting the innocent is extremely important. Take these steps. If you can avoid resistance, avoid it, but you may need to, particularly if you're trained. How does your property deal with sexual abuse? We've talked about going through our sexual harassment policy, various things, and this is on management and administration, not on how to engage and avoid issues of sexual abuse. But just a few things with your property. There's no place where an individual should be alone with children. Always do your best to make sure that there's at least 2 people with kids. And if at all possible in your construction, have open doors or windows available wherever kids are or wherever there's counseling one-on-one, particularly across gender. And again, regarding bringing people into your church, do background checks and do training. We don't want to see anybody harmed in our churches. They should be safe places. Well, we handled a whole lot of potential things that could go wrong and how to handle them. Any quick questions about dealing with disasters, medical issues, or threats? Seeing none.
Since nobody has any questions, just a couple of comments that I will throw in. The idea of an active shooter situation, and you referred to the FBI's list, and yes, that's the mass shooting, so there has to be 4 casualties or they don't count it. The chat place that I referred to, the deadly incident report records all incidents that could have ended in death, whether it was by car, by pipe, by bomb, by shooting, fire, arson, with people inside. Arson on a building without people, not counted. That list has covered since 1999. And I think the last update, which came out this month, takes it up through 21. So 22 years of complete records. It is the most complete and accurate record of deadly incidents or deadly force incidents to churches. And it doesn't just look at churches of a Christian nature, but of all faiths. And the interesting thing is the top 3 reasons that a church might have a deadly threat don't have anything to do with the reasons that most people think of. The top 3 reasons will affect any and all churches, regardless of size. Number 1 is robbery. Number 2 and 3 are similar, but not exactly the same. One is domestic issues, and families are messy. And the size of the church doesn't matter whether you have families that are in struggle and in turmoil. And then the third one is similar to that, where it's not necessarily family, but it's interpersonal issues. And terrorism or racial reasons are way down the list. That's not the main reasons why churches have shootings. It's just not. But the other comment too, on a 911 call, if you are ever in a situation where you need to call 911, if it is clear you are the only one who is calling or likely the only one calling, then stay on the line with them and help direct them to where you need them to be. They will always tell you to stay on the line. But if it is a situation where there are going to likely be dozens or hundreds of people calling, give the specific information that you have to give them, where you're at, what you saw happen, and that you're safe and hang up. Let the next person then call to be able to give them information that may further help them get to where they need to go. But if one or two people call in and tie up the line and nobody else gets in, you may not have the most accurate or most complete information, and they need more.
Yeah, that's super good.
So even though they tell you stay on the line, you are not required to stay on the line. Get off the line, let somebody else help.
Yeah, very good. That's really, really good. One other thing that prompted me to remind people of that I forgot in the presentation, when you call 911, particularly if it's a police call for a violence-related incident, understand that when the police come, they will be looking for violent people. So very much be sure that you're aware of that your hands are up, that you aren't appearing threatening, and that you answer their questions very calmly. We don't want accidents to happen. And by the way, by and large, police are our friends. So, and not that this matters, but when I was pastoring in Chicago, our church was lit on fire by an arsonist. While I was pastoring in Chicago, we had a number of shooters go through the church, never when the congregation was meeting there on a Sunday morning. We've had many robberies, people breaking in and damaging the property to get in. Depending on where you are, things can be less safe and you need to be more aware. Liz, you meet in a park on a regular basis. You have no control over who comes into the park. And crazy things can happen in a park. So being vigilant and aware, super good, super important. I know Mao, their church just broken into 2 weeks ago, I believe. So crime happens and violent people exist. And as Michael pointed out, they're not usually targeting you because of your religious convictions. They're usually looking for money or some way to score the next hit or getting even with somebody in a personal matter. Well, look, friends, we are so almost done. I've got a few more things that I'm going to go through regarding some legal and financial issues related to property. One segment that we had talked about for today was how do you lead a meeting? We're not going to do that. The notes are online. I hope that you will look at them. There's actually some good stuff and some good tools to elicit conversation from people. It's very good, but it's not particularly related to management and administration. So let's go to the next session regarding, again, this is mostly geared toward property, legal matters relating to property. We've talked about some legal matters related to hiring and personnel. We've talked about some legal matters related to finance and budgeting. So now again, we're talking about property and property management. There are some things that are especially important if you have property ownership. You own the property to be aware of. We're talking a little bit about tax exemption, what its value is for you, engaging in contracts and some things that may or may not be useful for your church, and how do we properly insure things. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about property ownership in the church. Liz, you have a savings campaign for your church that maybe you're hoping maybe to have some property down the road. So all these things would be important. And Mao and Michael, you both have churches that almost certainly need these things. Every church, in terms of its property, I'll talk about that in a minute, has a trust clause. Who does it belong to? It belongs to the local church, but also the Free Methodist Church USA. Every church has deeds which relate to who actually owns the property, blueprints about how the property was built, and some key things regarding financing. You need to be aware of all of these as a leader, manager, or administrator in your church. So one thing I want to talk about is just ownership of the property. Who owns the property? Well, no individual owns any property in a not-for-profit organization, at least in America. And that goes for churches. No individual owns a church. A church is owned by, the property is owned by the church, which, at least in California, is a not-for-profit tax-exempt religious corporation. It's true around the country. So no individual owns the church, but the church owns the church building. But the church building owned by a local church is also held in trust for the Free Methodist Church USA. And every church property in the Free Methodist Church has this trust clause that says the property is held in irrevocable trust for the Free Methodist Church USA and is subject to all its provisions of its Book of Discipline. Property includes all houses of worship existing now or later constructed on the property. The following additional provisions apply. All seats must be free because we're a Free Methodist Church. All trustees and their successors, any society or congregation, and all entities or persons with any interest in the property shall permit a minister to hold religious services on the property if the minister is authorized under the Book of Discipline and hold services in accordance with it. And the property may be sold and the proceeds disposed of only in accordance with the Book of Discipline. Now, this is an important clause because, Michael, as you're talking about possibly closing the church, I pray with you that it does not. There's nothing saying that it must, but there is a time for some churches to close their doors. No church that the Apostle Paul, the greatest evangelist of all time, ever started still stands today. The movement stands, but the building doesn't. So it happens. It's part of life. When a church closes and that property is now an asset, who does it belong to? In the Free Methodist Church, it belongs to the Free Methodist Church USA and or to the conference, really to the conference administered for the Free Methodist Church USA. And those assets then are dealt with by the conference. In our conference, a church that is closed is either repurposed for a new church plant or it's closed and it's sold, and the proceeds go, according to our policy, 80% toward planting a new church, 20% for managing other properties. So that's kind of how that operates. But regardless, it's a good thing that we're able to have that kind of care for property, and it's true for every church that trust clause exists. Most churches have a deed. I've also discovered most churches that own property don't know where that deed is. That's not good. You should have your deed. In fact, I recommend that it be in your red book, the corporate binder that we were talking about. That's proof of property ownership. If you have a deed, if you buy something new, you file it with the county recorder. That then becomes proof to the county and the state that that property belongs to Happy Church USA. Always keep a certified copy of your deed. Know where it is. If you don't know where it is, then get a copy of it from the county recorder. Someday you're going to need it. More important than the deed when it comes to maintaining your property, are your blueprints. This is another thing that I've discovered most churches, if they're older than 50 years, don't have. They don't know where they are. Well, it's not necessarily bad, but it's better to have blueprints because if you do maintenance and they happen to need a rewiring or replumbing, for example, or you're doing construction and you want to add a wing onto your property for, say, a Sunday school wing, then those blueprints will save you tons of money and time. You can just give those to the contractors and they will know exactly where to find the old wiring and exactly how and where to build the new construction. Without blueprints, they will charge you a truckload to discover all of this on their own. So if you don't have the blueprints, get them. Where do you get them? Most churches have filed with their city permits in order for the construction to be built. City Hall will almost certainly have a copy of your blueprints. Maybe they don't. Another person to talk to is the realtor that handled the buying or selling of that property. Maybe they don't have it. If you can find out who built it, go to the architectural firm, they will have it. But the first and easiest place to get it is City Hall. And Michael, if you end up closing and needing to sell the church, having those blueprints on hand will actually be really helpful and partly a selling point for whoever needs to look at that. That may not be your concern. That might be the concern of the superintendent. But again, I'm believing with you that won't happen.
His responsibility, and we have in the last 3 years, closed a church east of here east of McPherson even. And they ended up selling it to another church. So it's still being used as a church, which is great. In this particular building, because of its age, there is no sprinkler. So yes, it would be good for somebody to have some idea, and there is not enough wiring. It is way behind normal codes on a lot of levels. And it just, if anybody were to buy it, it's going to take a ton of money just to bring it up to what normal codes are today,
Right.
which is unfortunate, but yep.
Right. Yeah, I think again, if you can get your blueprints, the better. If you put a sprinkler system in and you had the blueprints on the wiring and plumbing, it will probably save you about $5,000 to $10,000 rather than having the contractor come in and do all that. So Elizabeth, when you guys buy your own church, y'all save the blueprints. Keep them irrevocably.
I wish I knew this earlier, because we had a problem in the house. It's an old house that we bought. And all of a sudden, we don't have the blueprint. And I didn't even think about that. All of a sudden, our power in the room turned off. And then another time in the bathroom. And then in the living room, we called several electricians. They didn't know, they were not able to find what's wrong. And then we needed power. So we had to call a contractor and had everything rewired, and so that they'll be able to find what's wrong. And that's thousands of money.
Yep. Yeah. Again, regarding administration and management, keeping track of things like this, whether it's your personal home or your church or business, it never seems important until you need them.
Right.
Yeah. But then someday you do need them. Okay, so as we continue on this conversation, I just want to talk a little bit about financing. Not a whole lot, just a little bit. I think it's important to recognize every church really ought to have, if you have a building or you plan to build one, a capital fund, and that fund can also be your deferred maintenance fund, but a fund that you're always setting aside money for the building, because the building will always need money. It is in some ways a money pit. So you always will need money for the building. Now, again, it's worthwhile if it's facilitating ministry. It's not worthwhile if it's not. There always will come a point where you need to make decisions about, is this facility still facilitating ministry? However, regardless, if a church does, say, for example, not save for that rainy day when the roof goes out and it needs to borrow money for some construction, your biggest friend is the Free Methodist Foundation, Free Methodist Financial. I think they renamed themselves recently. They are very good to work with. They want to support and help churches. They will give a loan. However, every loan taken out by a local church must be approved and co-signed by the conference. The conference is the guarantor of every financial transaction made by a local church. That's both awesome and scary. It's awesome because it gives local churches who usually would not have the financial backing or strength to even borrow money necessary for many building projects without the conference co-signing. So in that regard, it's a huge benefit to local churches. It's a little scary for the conference because it means if the church doesn't pay, then the conference has to pay. That should be scary for every church because the conference isn't an isolated entity. It is every church. And so often, and this has happened in some conferences where there have been major defaults on loans, when the conferences had to develop a plan where it's essentially levied a financial requirement with every church in the conference to help pay for that defaulted loan. Because again, the conference isn't a standalone entity, it's the churches of the conference. So most conference property management teams, board of administration, they will approve necessary loans, but they want to take care the loan is defaulted on, which doesn't happen often. But if a loan is defaulted on, then all the churches need to pay it back. So one of the really important, just two things to remember about capital funds and maintenance is always be fundraising for this and always be saving for this. It's always better to do that than to ask for emergencies on the fly. Enough emergencies on the fly will tell people in your church that you weren't a careful planner, that you're probably mishandling funds, because when they're giving funds to the church, they're expecting the leaders to take care of it properly. So set aside money for these long-term maintenance issues. And regularly, when I say fundraise, I don't mean beg to fix the broken boiler. I mean regularly talk about whatever your capital campaign is and give people a chance to give to that. I can guarantee some people will only give to foreign missions. I mean, above and beyond the normal giving. Some people will only give to help the homeless and the poor in your community. Some people will only give if they think it's going to benefit the pastor they love. And some people will only give if it's going to benefit the building they care about. So when you do fundraising, find ways to capitalize on all the things that people care about. Fundraising for the building is one of those things. So do fundraising, do save, and you won't have many problems regarding your property unless you pay taxes on it. Now, fortunately, most churches are tax exempt. It does require a few steps. If you haven't, for many of our churches, their church plans, they're just starting. Elizabeth, you're going through this issue now. Mal has been dealing with this issue with her church, even though it's been around for a while. In order, at least in California, Michael, I don't know how it is in Kansas. In order to not pay taxes on your property, you must file every year by February 15 for tax exemption for that property and or parsonage. So every year you need to file your tax exemption request with the state. Now we send out reminders every year as the conference. We have the forms, we can help you do it, but the church must do it. In California, the parsonage is not automatically part of the church or considered church property. There's a special filing for church parsonages called the welfare exemption. The welfare exemption will almost always be granted to a church if it can demonstrate that the church house is used specifically for ordained clergy that are employed by the church to accomplish its mission. Almost certainly will not be given if it's used, say, for a youth pastor who's not ordained. Regardless, these filings must take place every year or you lose your tax exempt status and you have to pay taxes. And unpaid taxes acquire hefty fees and fines. So everybody make sure that you regularly do this. Let me tell you about some threats to tax exemption. If you share space with another church that's also tax exempt, no threat. That's awesome. If you share space with another organization that is not tax exempt, even if they don't pay you money, you could lose your tax exempt status. If you share your space with a tax exempt religious organization, say, I'll make this up, I'll pretend, Michael, that you're in California and that your church wants to open its doors to a Hmong refugee group that wants to meet for church worship services. That's great. You say, wonderful, come on in. And we're going to have a cost sharing agreement where you pay $300 a month, and that just offsets costs. Great, no problem. As long as the income from what you charge for space sharing doesn't exceed 50% of your income streams, it's not a problem. If it does, it's taxable income to your church, which won't threaten your tax exemption, but you do have to pay taxes on it as income. So just be aware of that. Currently, at least in California, churches do not file annual taxes with the federal government or the state, which is great, unless they operate businesses or have unrelated business income, which could be, say, for example, a church that rents your facility and pays you more than half of the other income from the church. If that happens, you do have to file and pay taxes on an annual basis. It's not complicated. but if you don't do it, it could really cost you. So just be aware of these things. Sharing space with people in your community is not always a good idea. One quick thing about contracts. We talked about space sharing. Let me share with you this idea that you should always use, if you're going to share space with another organization or even rent it out for a wedding to people, which you can do, that's great. Make sure they sign a contract. We have a contract for that very purpose. It's in one of the links that I'll send you after this class. It very specifically says something along the lines of, this building can only be used for purposes that are aligned with the Free Methodist Church and its doctrine. This is super important, particularly statistically, not so much, but it can happen. If somebody uses your church, let's say, for example, from the LGBTQ community to conduct a wedding, and you give them permission to do so as a public building out of love, care, and compassion, for whatever reason, that's all good. And they didn't sign this agreement, then it is very possible, and this has actually happened with some churches, where the use not in accordance with the doctrine of the church was granted to some groups, thereby making the church a public space and no longer able to distinguish between those that could use it, then becomes a public space and unrestricted. However, it is within your rights to restrict it as long as you're clear about it. And so have people sign the facility use contract every time. Again, it's something we have online. You can use it. We really encourage you, if you're going to share space with people, have a clear contract that spells out compliance with our values. We also have, and I hope you look at it, some samples on space sharing, on what people can be responsible for. Just always be clear. A contract is a legally binding agreement. It's not just a handshake. So whether your contract is with a professional, say, for example, a tax accountant who's doing your audits, or whether it's with an employee, we talked about employee contracts, or whether it's with a service that you're having done for the church, a cleaning service. The reason you sign a contract is because they're legally binding. That is, you have recourse against them if they mess things up. They have recourse against you as well. I think I just talked about all of these things without going to the different lines. Yay. So finally, we're on the home front here. Your property needs to be properly insured. This is part of the responsibility of your leadership team, your board of administration. This is key to administration and administration. You must have property insurance. You must. It's not optional. You must have property insurance for at least, I would suggest, a rebuild of the property in the event of its destruction. Since property values change regularly, I highly recommend you review your property annually or biannually at least, and make some adjustments to your insurance based upon property values and things that may have changed. You should also have liability and professional insurance. The Free Methodist Church recommends that you have at least $1 million policy regarding liability. Regarding liability is protecting people that could be injured on your property. So if somebody falls in the middle of a worship service and they break their ankle, it is very likely that your liability insurance, not their healthcare insurance, will need to cover the cost of repair for that broken ankle. So make sure that you have liability insurance. Things can happen. But professional and sexual misconduct insurance is important as well. The number one cause of lawsuits against churches is sexual misconduct, in particular, abuse of minors. I'd like to believe that those are frivolous. I'm afraid that perhaps they are not. Either which way, you need to protect your church and your pastors and professionals that are working for your church. So professional insurance, for example, would keep your pastor, George, from being sued if, let's say, for example, he preaches a sermon and he says, heaven is better than hell and heaven awaits those who die. And somebody takes that in kind of a mental illness way and says, oh my goodness, I'm a Christian. Heaven is great. Life sucks during COVID. I'm going to commit suicide. And so that person commits suicide. That person was 16 years old and their parents sue the pastor for teaching about heaven. Even though he said nothing about suicide, a lawsuit could come against your church. They could even win. Crazier things have happened. So you need to have professional liability insurance against a lot of crazy stuff that happens. It's also liability against things that you don't do that you should have done as well. So have professional and sexual liability insurance. Lawsuits against the church come mostly because of abuse of a minor, but also property disputes, personal injury, zoning, and a lack of insurance coverage. So friends, be insured. Legally in California, you are required to have workman's comp insurance if you have any employees. So this is another thing that you do to protect your employee when injured on the job. Frankly, this also protects volunteers in your church. And all of our churches who have insurance have workman's comp. But let's say the youth pastor is, for Christmas time, on top of a ladder, putting the Star of David on top of a Christmas tree, and it's a 30-foot ladder and a giant tree, and the youth pastor falls and breaks his arm. Very tragic, very sad. Workman's comp insurance covers that. That's what pays for that. And it's important to have it. That youth pastor's health insurance isn't going to cover it because it's a job-related incident. And that would be true even if it's a volunteer, potentially. A quick word regarding security, and I'll think I'm going to wrap it up here. Your church can be broken into. Make it hard for people that do that. Lock it up. Always lock. And always make sure that you know where the keys are. Don't hand out the keys to everybody willy-nilly. Every church that has more than one key should have a lock box in a secure place that has the master keys to everything in the church. Copies of those keys, and only copies of those keys, should be distributed to those who will regularly open and lock the church. You can also, by the way, have wonderful electronic security systems. That's great. Either which way, you need to make sure that the codes are somewhere safe, that somebody can have access to, and that they're never lost. But always lock the church. Always ensure somebody is responsible to secure the church. And one of the most simple things that every church can do is make sure it's well lit at night. The church I mentioned, pastoring in Chicago, drug deals and nefarious sexual activity in the backs of cars were common incidents in our parking lot at night, but almost never under our floodlights. So lighting, where things were lit, people would not engage in unsavory behavior. But where things were well lit, people usually did avoid. So well lit is good. Security cameras are also something you can, and some churches do, install. We had a church in Oakdale, California, where somebody is regularly breaking the windows, like once a week. Horrible. Finally, a security camera went up. They were able to identify the person. Thank goodness, because that person had been breaking church windows all over town. Without that ability to identify who was doing it, I don't know, he'd still be breaking windows. Now he's in jail. I hope he repents and finds Jesus, but I'm glad he's not breaking windows anymore. My goodness, my friends, we have gone through a lot together today. We've engaged mission, vision, and values, budgeting and finance, tax issues, human resources, hiring, correcting, leading people, dealing with our property, dealing with emergencies, and all of that. I hope it's been helpful, and a good use of your time. Are there any final questions that we have as we come to a close? And I'll just go around and actually give everybody a chance to say something, and then we'll close in prayer, and I'll tell you what's next. I'll start with Michael. Anything you'd like to say, any questions, any things you wish we would have covered that we didn't today?
There was plenty for today. Thank you very much. I don't think more would have fit. One other comment that I will make on the idea of sexual abuse is as unfortunate as it is, and having worked with children professionally, my wife and I, if you suspect or you get a report of one of your staff, volunteer or paid, of doing things improper, don't try and take care of it yourself. Report it. And the reason I say that unequivocally is that the Baptist Church and the Catholic Church are both dealing with fallout from pastors and churches who wouldn't say anything, and therefore that person would apologize and say, I just have a problem, I'll go away and you won't have to worry about it anymore. And all they would do is go on to the next church. And there was no record. So even when a background check was run on the person, there was no record anywhere that they had a problem. And so it is important that it be reported, a file be created, and then that file will either exonerate them, and maybe they'll be able to find another church to work with. Maybe they'd be able to come back to yours. But at least if there is still questions about it, it would be recorded and other churches would be able to see that. It is important.
Yeah, super
thank you,
good.
Mark. Thank you, Mark, for doing this. Thank you for letting me, not in your conference, tag along.
Thrilled to have you.
I enjoy your posts. I don't always read them every morning, but I always look at the picture when I do get into Facebook. And I'm looking forward to meeting you face to face in Florida.
That'll
Will
be
you
fun.
be there?
General
Will
conference.
you be there for the prayer conference as well or not?
It's my plan.
Good. I'll be there
Prayer
for
is the
that as
first
well.
priority. Yeah.
Yep. See you
Thank
there.
you very much. By the way, Michael, he brought us something really good. This wasn't teaching about how to actually engage sexual misconduct or abuse, more to keep on the radar. But do be aware, in our conference, in our churches, pastors are mandated reporters. And people that work with children, really, you can't not say something. It is not a useful or good, it's not a good thing to do. That's like letting the wolf into the sheep herd and have his or her way. So we are mandated reporters. We do take this seriously. And Michael, I'm so glad you leaned into that. Thank you. Mal, you're driving, so I'll ask you before you crash.
No, I actually get on the road, so that's why I went off camera. So I'm making my way on to the airport. I have a flight to catch. But no, this was definitely an assurance of how we're operating as a church, and it just is good to be reminded, and is good to assure that some practices are in place, but there are practices that need to be revisited and be put into policies. Because I mean, with floods and like all that, we don't have disaster plans in order. And I think the reason we never really thought of that is because majority of our church is all family, right? So at the end of the day, our whole family is going to be in one place, but we never thought of anyone outside of us. So I think it's definitely an eye-opener to be able to think beyond just within your own family, and others that comes into the church and stuff, and being able to establish policies. And even as you mentioned, like the hardest things is having to work with your own families individual. And as witness, and I think that was a lot of our struggle in the years that we've had. But now that certain things have came to light, it's helping us seeing that this is all the more reason why things needs to be set in writing and things need to be set in policies, because no matter the relationship, you're still an organization, you're still a business, and it has to be functioned in the same manner, regardless of what your worldly relationship is. And that was what this class has given me. And so I thank you for the opportunity to be able to share that and to be able to help me in terms of my role and my leadership within my church. And not only with that, but, as a benefit for the Sierra Pacific Conference.
Bless you, Mel. Thank you. Drive safe. Go 49ers. Elizabeth, anything you'd like to ask or clarify before we call an end to this august association of people?
Well, I would just like to thank you for all the things that you have shared, and everyone in the group seeing things in from different perspectives. And I am seeing a lot of work here for me. Anyway, I would like to thank you, especially on the part where you said we need to know the condition of our people, our congregation. And indeed, you made our transition to Sacramento very, very smooth and easy because of what you have given us, the type thing that you shared with us before we came to Sacramento and even before we started ministry. So with that, we were able to see where the church is at, what the church is doing, what the church is not doing, what the people are asking for, all these things that we needed to know so that we will be able to start ministering to these people. And that made us a very, very good start when we came to Sacramento. And for that, I'm really very, very thankful. And this course that we went through today will really help build the structure of the church, because for the years that they've been together, there's nothing that I can find in the church. And so I took it upon myself, the burden to help structure the church so that the next generation will have something to follow.
Amen. So grateful for your work there. It's so important. Good. She mentioned type, which is 3-year planning engagement, something we ask all of our churches to go through, where we evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the church, provide some ideas about how it can engage the community with the good news of Jesus. Essentially, it's a template for the vision intersection profile that we talked about earlier today. Thank you for sharing that. Everybody, it's been a real pleasure hanging out with you today, and I really, really enjoyed it. I'm going to pray a blessing upon you,